What do you think? Are we ready to start? You ready to start? Can you hear? Thank you. Yeah, we have a little, we're moving around here a little bit because, of course, you're going to be captured on film for archiving. Okay, I'm going to try to stand still because that's one of the issues with this. So, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for coming. Too much, right? We have a very exciting program today and thought-provoking about open access. Who's doing this? We're chasing each other here.
My cord's limited here.
He's a wild Canadian. That's his problem. So what we want to do is address what is open access and why should it matter to us. And our partners in this presentation today are the School of Education, the Center for Teaching and Professional Development, and Professional Development Subcommittee. Thank you. I want to say, first of all, I'm Barbara Butler. I think I know most of you here. And as Dean of the Library, we have been interested in open access for a long time, of course, experiencing it for a long time as well. And that shouldn't come as a surprise to any of you, since access to information is our mission. Now, the thing is that access is limited potentially by scholarly publishing practices, and most definitely by escalating costs of research publications. And about that we care deeply, and so should you. And we feel too that access to information really is the right to know, and it really should be considered a public good. So when we step back and look at it globally, restrictions on access to knowledge are very frightening. So this is why we need to care, and we should all in this room consider what it is we need to understand about this today. And we have someone very interesting to help us think more deeply about this. We have with us Dr. John Willinsky from Stanford University, and well, you can help me with this. You are the
Kosala Family Professor
in the School of
Education.
Yes, at Stanford. Oh, we're both mic'd. How interesting. Yep. You've been at Stanford since 2007.
Yes.
And prior to that, he's checking me on this, he was at the University of British Columbia as, I think, another professorship of
Pacific Press Professor of Literacy. Literacy and Technology.
I love that title, Literacy and Technology. Yeah. Absolutely perfect. And he did many things before that. He is also director of the Public Knowledge Project, which is, can I call it an alliance?
That sounds good.
An alliance of Simon Fraser University, University of British Columbia, and Stanford, and perhaps some other entities, with an overarching goal to promote access globally to public research. This is a very timely topic, since there's a bill in Congress right now on scientific information. We may hear more about that in a moment. So I don't have your dossier in front of me here, so I'm going to wing it because it's over there. You are very widely published, extensively published. Do you want to read from the notes there?
Yes, I am. I am widely published.
You can put in your own words if you like. And we have some examples at the back, a lot of background information if you're interested in the back there, and a couple of his books, which are astounding. He is an advocate for public access to research and knowledge, and a noted authority on scholarly communication. Do you agree with that?
Yes. It's all here in print.
Okay, perfect. So he wended his way up from Stanford this morning and is with us now to help us think about the broader issues related to public access.
Yes, I came by public transport. I was just thinking about that. Train, 2 subways, and a bus. Oh, and a personal car to arrive here. So it was, yes. The ferry, I didn't need the ferry to get across the bay. But
I'm going to get out of
okay.
your way.
Thank you, Barbara. That's a pleasure. Here's the introduction if you want to refer to it at another point. It is a great pleasure to be here. And I've learned a lot even since I've arrived. And I am honored, in fact, to be at the university that Mario Savio, the free speech movement, to think that a rocky academic career, but a stellar contribution, but that he arrived here and taught physics and math, I understand, for a number of years, and so this is a great honor. Put that together with Peanuts, with Charles Schulz, and the idea of the most common of knowledges, that there will never again be a generation raised on a single comic. And so that commonality of knowledge, along with a very strong political commitment to the sharing of ideas, to the free speech movement, which was very much about the access to knowledge, but access to political sensibilities and to the ability to critique and use that knowledge, makes this a very important port for me. Combine that with Jack London. I am a school teacher by trade, and my interests in access to knowledge really is the answer to a simple question: why did I work so hard to teach those kids how to read, if it was not to have a lifetime's worth of access to knowledge? And once they had finished all of Jack London's novels, they might move on to other material. But we illustrated and read and performed White Fang, and it was wonderful to see the archives, but to also understand that Jack London had his own kind of politics that were very much involved in. Actually, I need to think about this more, because there are 2 sides to Jack. There's a fairly strong militant, I don't want to say fascist, but a strong side, and then there was a socialist, young socialist, Jack London, very sympathetic to the sharing of property and to the sharing of wealth. And so those themes all seem to resonate through this library, and particularly through the cafe. The coffee is marvelous, and Schroeder would play fabulously on 2 or 3 sips of that coffee. But let me take you through a number of ideas, a number of aspects of this open access question. I want to make it very topical and very current. I want to bring you the news. We're in California. I don't need to bring you the weather. But I want to bring you the news, and then I want to set it into a larger perspective, because I think this is a historic moment. At the same time, I think it's part of something that we've always been part of. Earlier than Mario, earlier than Harvard, earlier than even the first universities. I want to try to tie it in on a broader scale. So we're going to try to cover at least all of that in the time before they're serving the non-alcoholic refreshments at the end of this talk. And let me start with this broader sensibility, with the sense of a single concept here. I mean, the turning point is the concept of open. We call this open access, and the federal government actually in this country is calling it public access, and I somewhat think that's a little clear. I'm somewhat in favor of that. I was originally in favor of free to read, because I come from an English literature background, and there's a kind of a consonance, a kind of a ring to free to read, and it's button size, and it seemed to work really well. But it's called open access, and I'll explain why, because it's part of a larger open movement, that there's something much bigger at stake than simply being free to read. And so once that was explained to me in a demeaning way, that I was too narrowly focused on the free-to-read part, and this was part of a larger movement, I'll try to use that information and to inform you about it. And maybe I should just stay with that concept for a moment to put it in this historical perspective. The open access, and really it was about 2001 that the term first was used, open access, was agreed upon, in fact, by a group of scholars who, in terms of giving the movement, the sensibility, because in the 90s people were already sharing what they knew freely online. In the 90s, certain professors were throwing their articles up on the early days of the web, if they weren't in the pre-days of FTP, putting their articles up on the web. They would send them into a journal in the regular fashion, and then they would put them up on the web. Computer science, but not always, not just computer science professors in the 90s, faculty members. And what they discovered was before they even had an acknowledgement from the journal, they would have had interaction. They would have had people picking it up. And before there was Google, this was not an easy thing to do. This is the Alta Vista days. And so people were discovering that if you put your information up on the web and allowed people to discover it, they would. And they would engage with it. And that the journal process, you would, by the way, after 6 weeks, get a letter of acknowledgement. Thanks so much for sending your article to us. We'll be in touch with you within your lifetime about the results of our review process on the article. And by the time you got the review, 6 months later, those professors who did throw their work up on the web, they would be able to write back to the journal, thanks for your critiques. I've already improved the article. I've had an engagement with a number of different authors, and a number of different authorities in the area, and that in fact my work is already better because of that, but I appreciated the reviews. And I will take those into account. So there was, by the end of the 90s, there was already a sensibility that something had changed. And to try to pull that together, in 2001, they called it the open access movement. And they called it open access because of open source. Because in 2000, the term open source software came about. There used to be, there still is, right, not used to be, excuse me, the free software movement. Right? So we have a free software movement in the 90s that gets consolidated around open source software. And so there was already a sense then that something else was changing, that the platforms, not just the knowledge and exchange, but the systems and platforms were opening. And since then we have an open data movement, led by not Al Gore, but Bill Clinton, in fact. When Bill Clinton made the decision, seemingly, made the decision that the Genome Project, all of the data that had been gathered in that great competition, do you remember the great competition of the 90s? Who was going to decode and analyze the Genome Project first? Craig Venter and the group funded by NIH. And as it turned out, we've all forgotten who won, because we all won. Because all of that material, all of the analysis, the genetic analysis, all of the sequencing is now part of GenBank, is part of a public, open resource. And we won because not only was that contest, not only was that initial sequencing made publicly available, but there's now a given sensibility that any article that's published in a journal that involves genetic sequencing must be deposited. The data, not just the article, the data must be deposited in GenBank, which is part of PubMed. And so there was, and it's a narrow field, but it's a very important one, because biologists, I don't know if you know any, or any associated with any, or maybe there's some in the audience, they haven't always been the most famous for sharing their data. The closed notebook kind of movement. In fact, there is an open notebook movement in science as well. But this idea then that we have open source software platforms, that we have open data, a sensibility that we need to share the data. And you understand, when you share the data, what you do is you increase the value of the science. If people can examine your data, the science is going to be that much more valid, that much more reliable, and that much more productive. Because if other people can see and share and compare their data, their science is going to be better. It's also going to be more economical. Because, and this is something in the social sciences, I am a social, not a socialist scientist like Jack London, but I am a social scientist. And in the social sciences, we have this terrible dilemma of having to generate fresh data with every study because nobody shares. And we generate fresh data, so 80% of our budget costs will be involved in generating the data that other people have similar sorts of. And so it's expensive, and it's less epistemologically, less in terms of the quality of knowledge, because we're not comparing our data, because we're not reanalyzing our data, we're not combining or accumulating our data in a cumulative sense. And so the open data movement is making a huge contribution. So we have open source. There's going to be a test, so let's see if we got this. Open source, which refers to software platforms. You can just move your lips and I'll try to read them. software platforms, and then we have open access. I haven't explained exactly what it refers to, but I'll tell you in a moment. Open data, where they're sharing data, and the leading project here is the genome, but it's not the only one where data is being shared. In astronomy, it's always very tempting for someone in an English major to do puns on astronomical data, but there's a lot of data, and it is very open and being shared through the support of the U.S. government and through a number of institutions. So there are a number of fields where open data has taken hold. We have this open notebook science, which is not all that strong. We have a group in biology that are sharing their instruments, open research instruments. So there's a general spirit of openness, and we might think it's all now, all since the turn of the century. But I want to argue that the openness of knowledge is part of the very purpose of why we are here. That is the very sense in which we are sharing ideas. And a few weeks ago, I had the pleasure of going to San Jose State University and speaking. Have any of you been to San Jose State, the library there? This is the coolest thing in the world. It is a public library and a university library combined. Martin Luther King Jr. Library. And you go in, and the students and the public are there having coffee. Not as good, but still. Having coffee, and they have it sort of organized by floors, which is kind of cute, and nobody really pays that much attention to it. And that everybody has access to all of these books. And that, to me, as I said to them, was that if this had been the model all along, we wouldn't need an open access movement. There wouldn't need to be a public access policy. It would be regarded as a right, as natural, that where knowledge is gathered, people are allowed to access it. And San Jose is to be commended for that kind of openness. And they told me about all the cost efficiencies, but I kind of like the spirit of it all. It was quite impressive. So this idea then that there are a series of current moments needs to be taken back to some earlier point, and there are many of them. I just want to stop at two. One of them is the monasteries. The monasteries of the medieval monastic movement of the Latin Christian West. I'm having a look at these monasteries. It wasn't a great life. I'm trying to compare working conditions, benefits, between my job now and what was going on there. And the phrase I loved was that the one monk mentions just in passing that he would be much more productive if the ink wasn't freezing in the inkwell in his scriptorium. Not that he minded the cold, mind you. It was cutting down on the productivity. So you get a sense that the monasteries were not always that friendly. They were also walled and closed communities. But they were huge cultural centers. And one of the exceptions, probably two exceptions they made in terms of the closed sense of the monastery, the monastic life. One was, I feel like I have to check this again because it's so astounding to me. One was they lent books out to the community. These aren't just your regular pulp fiction books. These are illuminated manuscripts. Now, I've looked at a lot of illuminated manuscripts. I've never seen a pocket in the back with a date stamped or anything like that. So I don't know how frequent this was, that they would lend out, but that they would come up with this policy, that they felt they had this responsibility, that if they were going to store this knowledge, and they called them libraries, but it turns out they were just boxes where they put the books inside. Now, when I had the idea of they didn't have enough books, and that it took so long to produce the books, but that they had this sense of responsibility. The other aspect was public education. That as closed as they were, the monks would leave the monastery and nuns would leave the monastery and teach in the community. And that sense then that where knowledge gathers, there's a kind of spillover, a kind of openness to letting people in and an openness in terms of affecting the community. Second example, the Bodleian Library. I had the pleasure of a lifetime, really, to teach a quarter at Oxford this January to, I missed the rains here, from January to March. Actually, I didn't miss the rains at all, did I? It was snow in Oxford, but I got to work in the Bodleian Library. And as someone who's been a tourist at Oxford for 30 years, this was a great treat for me. But once I got into the Bodleian Library, I realized it had been open the whole time. that it had always been called a public library. That what we think of as the most restrictive library at Oxford is in fact known as a public library. And that the very phrase of it being called Bodleian kind of got me too. Like it's an adjective. This seemed to me so English. It's not the Bodley Library. It's not the Charles Schultz Bodley Library. It's Bodleian. And so I said when I came to the door, well, in what ways is it Bodleian? And it turns out that Bodley builds this library, comes to Oxford, sees that the library is in total disrepair. In fact, there is no central library at Oxford in 1600. And Bodley is concerned about this, that it has been decimated, that they've sold off the desks. There are college libraries in each of the colleges, but those are like little clubhouses, little monasteries in effect. But there's no big library. It wasn't called public. And so he makes his money on sardines, which I always thought was kind of interesting, the kind of fishmonger that he was. And he gives his money to the University of Oxford to reconstruct the public library of Oxford. And in that, and at the time, the benefactor had such power that he gets to pick the librarian. All of the books come through him. And what he does is two things. He decides, first of all, that it's going to be public, that anyone, and there are great objections in the university, but he says, I'm building this library. And he's getting the wood. Like it doesn't open for 4 years. He gathers the wood and he says that he wants to have it for gentlemen, and then he expands it a little more to say anyone who's interested in study, in the pursuit of knowledge, should have access to this public library. The other thing he does is he encourages all of his friends to donate, to treat this library as a repository, as a place of preservation for knowledge, as a place that would protect knowledge. And so this double force, it has to be open, it has to be preserved. And so when I finally got into the Bodleian and read the regulations on it, it does. It has clauses after clause. It's open to the public who are engaged in serious study. I quickly stopped laughing, put my head down, stayed focused. Unemployed, hardship cases, no fee, and a series of stipulations that have guaranteed that that library has remained public. And that sensibility, do we have a policy, a walk-in policy here?
Anybody as well?
Yeah. So that sensibility of a walk-in policy, of a sense that there's a responsibility, is critical to this history. So if we have some idea, then this is the continuity, and I would bring up the sciences. I'm very tempted, although you're filming this, and I've used this too many times, the Newton example in terms of secrecy. But if you think about the scientific revolution of the 17th century, it's very much torn between alchemy and what we consider to be experimental science. But it hinges on this notion of moving from secrecy, and Newton was notoriously secretive, and openness and sharing. And at the beginning of the journal in the 17th century, the first journal in English and in French, the first journal in French, they did beat the English by 2 months, 3 months, no, technically 2 months. By 2 months, the journal itself was this act of making it public. So the first journal was a 16-page Philosophical Transactions. The title was almost as big as the journal. The Philosophical Transactions from 1665 is a 16-page pamphlet. Before that, you had to invest a week's wages to buy a book of scientific information. You might be invited into the Royal Society, and then suddenly a 16-page pamphlet made all of this available, reported on the transactions, described what was presented in the meetings. And Newton plays with this. I apologize to the public because I have used this one before. But Newton plays with this. Such a good story, though. And partly, too, because it gives me a chance to say that Newton only published one article in his lifetime. And so for some of us, we feel really good about that because we have him beat. Like, I let my mother know all the time. Newton, yeah, he was okay, yeah. Didn't publish much, but yeah, he was good. I don't want to embarrass Newton, but I've published way more than 2 or 3, 4 or 5 times than Newton in articles. He had some lovely books and did that. But Newton was torn because the Philosophical Transactions wasn't just open, in terms of knowledge going out, the philosophical transactions had a back door, no, a front door for people coming in, called letters. And for 4 years, Newton, sorry.
You're on a tether.
I'm on a tether, I know. Pretty soon I'd be sitting down with you and we'd be chatting, and I'm sorry. I wanted to meet each and every one of you. Excuse me. Is that good?
It's all right, you have another foot.
Good. I'll try not to put it in my mouth.
As far as you go.
Okay. So Newton experiments with the journal and discovers that people write back. And so this is about 1672, I think he publishes his first article, and for 4 years there are letters back and forth. And so the openness needs to be thought of in terms of this engagement. And it wasn't just scientists in the official sense, and there weren't really in the 17th century, there weren't scientists in the official sense. There was science, but the term scientist had not been used yet. But those who are known for their work. The Royal Society was made up of university professors. Newton was one of them, but they were in the minority. There were lots of gentlemen scientists, or gentlemen scholars, excuse me. And what the philosophical transactions established then over that period of when it began in 1665 to perhaps the end of the century was that there was a different way of doing science through this openness and engagement. And people pressed Newton on how he had conducted his science, his research. The article he publishes on optics, and it's this lovely thing with the blind, where you take a razor blade and you slice the blind, and you take a prism, and you catch a ray of the sun, and you see psychedelic... Rainbow. Yes, a spectrum, rainbow. Exactly. You've done this. So people wrote in and said, my blinds are in shreds. Isaac Newton, the family is exceedingly upset. Could you please describe how large the slit is to be? And Newton responds, and the term he uses is tedious. I find these letters tedious. As I explained, and he hadn't, he would write back, as I explained. And over the course of this correspondence of 4 years, the model of research articles developed. The notion of what it meant to be explicit, the ability to replicate an experiment happened. Month after month after month in the 16-page, which wasn't devoted entirely to Newton. So this idea that the openness of science is about the quality of science, you could have come forward, people. This is the first talk I've ever given, where there has been business class and economy. And I have 5 passes right here, upgrade passes, for those of you sitting in the back. And we are serving meals later. So if you did want to upgrade, it would save me...
Being on a tether.
Yes. And by the way, that feels... okay. You should just be... Okay. You can relax. So, apart from me being restricted and knowledge being open, if we have some historical sense then, and there are so many examples, although I do think that Newton is a particularly precious one, because Newton was involved in alchemy. There's a book out now about Newton and the counterfeiter. I don't know if you've seen, because Newton, he eventually reaches the very pinnacle of science and then goes on to become head of the mint, which was a kind of sinecure. But he takes it very seriously, and he goes after counterfeiters. And this recent book is about his detective work on the counterfeiter. But the idea of the authority and authenticity of the money, and this kind of openness again around this investigation that he conducts, has the same sense, because at the same time he is engaged in the study of alchemy, and is incredibly secretive about all of that. And we have at least notes from him suggesting that he went to his grave with many of these ideas that destroyed or not available. So let me jump ahead and take it then to the news, to yesterday. Let me move right along here. Yesterday there was an email sent to a number of us who are involved in this movement about an open letter to the Higher Education Committee. This is a letter signed by presidents of a great number of universities, a great number of leading universities, including my own and including the University of California system, And it is a letter that is addressed to the community, but it speaks specifically to, and Barbara made reference to this, the Federal Research Public Access Act. That the U.S. government, before Congress right now, there is a bill called the Federal Research Public Access Act that would make all of the research that is done, that is funded by the U.S. government, if the agency deals in more than $100 million in funding research, publicly available. And I want to explain to you and set some context for this. But what's interesting for me is that the letter from these presidents talks about a responsibility. Talks about the university's long-standing commitment to the advancement and conveyance of knowledge. It's not a term you hear very often. I mean, it's like the books system you have here that conveys knowledge. Don't you have one of those conveyance systems? Yeah, and so it's a wonderful, literal, not a metaphor. It's actually literally a conveyance system. It is mission critical. I haven't heard that term since Houston in 1991 or something. It is mission critical for the land-grant and publicly funded institutions among us. It addresses the complementary commitment to public service and public access that is included in our charters. So all of a sudden, open access is becoming a mission-critical element. And I want to describe to you how that stands today, and I want to suggest some things that you can do about it. Okay? So how it stands today. Open access is not open to all knowledge. It's not an openness to all knowledge. It is a narrow band. It is what we call in Silicon Valley the low-hanging fruit. And as a Canadian, I thought it was a metaphor. But in my backyard, it is low-hanging fruit, 12 months of the year. The lemons are like down here. So it's not very poetic, but it's, anyway. The low-hanging fruit is the research journal article. So open access refers to a particular domain of knowledge. It doesn't refer to books at this point, although there is an open monograph kind of movement underfoot. It refers to the electric, if you like, or the e-version, e-edition of journal articles. And open access is about how can we make those journal articles, which went online with great alacrity, which were available by the turn of the century by most of the publishers, and which are now certainly available from all the leading publishers at least, online, digitally. How can we make those freely available to those, and freely is even a kind of in quotation marks term, because free if you have internet connections, if you have a computer and a system that will operate in terms of the internet, the protocols, but at the same time it is as if you have invested that much in an internet cafe in Ghana, or that you have a library like this. You should have access to this knowledge. And so the open access refers to that particular domain. Now what portion, how much of that literature is freely available today? Well, this is an interesting aspect of it. The latest measures suggest that in 2009, 24.8, 25, I can round off, 25% of the articles published last year can be found freely online in multiple forms, and I want to describe those to you. So your chances, if you go on to PubMed, the best, life science is the best, the biggest, the largest, the best, Life Sciences Index. In fact, it's probably the best index in any subject area. I think the librarians would agree with me, the most sophisticated index. I wish we had it in education. In education, we have not the best index in the world, called ERIC. But in the life sciences, you have PubMed. And so if you play the lottery, put in a disease of some concern to you or your family, a list of articles will come up, and your chances are you doing the math with me? Your chances that you can read the full article are, work with me, 1 in 4. Look at what a group, crackerjack. This side of the room is just, it's that coffee, from downstairs. It's just, I know. Yeah. So 1 in 4 articles, your chances of being able to get the information that's relevant to your physician, to yourself, to the very consolation of knowledge in terms of an illness is at this point 1 in 4. It was 1 in 5 the year before. And you might think it's going to be 1 in, don't say 6, please. I would have to report you. But it's actually going to be much greater. And I want you to understand it. But we have that base. Now, there are 3 principal systems, really two, but one with a variation. Two, let's start with two, and I'll take it to three. Two systems by which that information is becoming freely available. These articles, by the way, the 1 and 4, are no matter where they're published. If they're published in the most expensive journal or they're published in a new journal, open access journal, they're turning up. And that's what I want to explain to you through two methods, journals and archives. Okay, let me start with the journals. There are open access journals. There are journals that make their work immediately, freely available. Now you might ask yourself, are those journals any good? And you might ask yourself, how many journals make their work freely and immediately available? And I'm glad you did. Well, no, I'm not actually glad you did, because I don't know how many there are. This is an embarrassing aspect. I forgot I was going to avoid this in this talk, and here I've done it again. There is, I have to tell you the whole truth here. I don't know how many journals there are in the world. This is my area of, you're not broadcasting? Can we stop the tape for 2 seconds? It's an interesting question, and I find it fascinating that we don't know. We know the IQ of students, and we know all sorts of things, but we don't know how many journals there are. And well, that's because they have an interesting lifespan of sometimes a very short period, and they rise up, and not everyone registers them. The figures I like, actually the one that I think is amusing, is that two very strong authorities in the field, one puts it at 50,000 journals, and one puts it at 25,000 journals. Now, I don't know if you, again, took a stats class, but that's a lot of variance. That's not good to have double the range. But in that area, open access journals, we have a lovely directory at the University of Lund. When you're going to Sweden next time, in the south of Sweden, it's a lovely medieval city. Lund keeps a directory, the library there keeps a directory, and they have about 4,800 open access journals listed. These journals are peer-reviewed. These journals make their work immediately available, and these journals are in every subject area imaginable, as far as I can tell. And they are indexed by title, by subject area, and a lot of the content is available, but not all of it. So that's 4,600 or so. I work with the Public Knowledge Project, as Barbara mentioned. We develop software called Open Journal Systems. This is open source software. It's tricky. Open source software that we use for open access journals. And we include open data as part of that, but that's a little too confusing. So we have I can't believe it's 6,500. It is 6,500. No, it's got to be 5,500. No, it is 6,500. 6,500 journals, excuse me. 6,500 journals are using this software. Even sounds, I remember when it was 5 journals and 50 journals. 6,500 journals are using this software, and about 80% of them are making their knowledge, their publications, freely available. And the two lists don't quite overlap. There's about a 20% overlap. So I would estimate there are probably 8,000 journals in the world that make their work immediately and freely available. Now, what about the status? Can you trust a journal that makes its work? Can you trust a journal that makes its work freely available? And I want to offer a couple of suggestions to you. The New England Journal of Medicine is not open access, but it makes all of its work freely available in 6 months following publication. Has that reduced the quality, the prestige of that journal at all? Would you be ashamed now because it is open access after 6 months, if we can call it that, or delayed access after 6 months, to appear in the New England Journal of Medicine? I hope not. The other good example in San Francisco is the Public Library of Science. They publish 6 or 7 journals, the Public Library of Science, and their journal in biology, their journal Biology, PLOS, Public Library of Science Biology, is the #1 cited journal in biology. Their medicine journal is like 2nd or 3rd, and so they have established that open access publishing is not a detriment. They have Harold Varmus. I don't know if you remember Harold Varmus. In fact, he's back in the Obama administration. Nobel Prize winners behind it, and he set out to establish that prestige could be achieved, high citation levels could be achieved with open access, and he has demonstrated that. So we have some sense that open access journals are providing an alternative. They are not hurting the reputation or prestige. Now, not every journal is going to be ranked #1. Not every journal will even have a 6-month, even journals that have 6-month delays like New England Journal of Medicine have that kind of status. But there is a sense that it is no longer a question of publishing online is a loss of status, or that publishing online will in fact hurt the opportunities of faculty members. And I need to add another statistical aspect here in terms of publishing online. But let me do the archiving first, and I'll tell you about the career advantages. A limited time offer that I've been making for some time. The second path to open access. The journals are they 5%, 10% of the field at this point? Well, I can't answer that because I don't know how many journals there are in the field, and I don't want that to get around. So if you just keep it to yourselves. But as soon as I find out, I'll be able to answer the question about what percentage of the journals are open access. But there's a second path. And I know it's not 25%, so that's why we need the second path. And that's called archiving. An interesting phenomenon. Remember those professors in the 90s who put their articles up? They also published them in journals. So they had an archived version of their article, and they had the published version of their article. And what happened? They got read more. They got cited more, and I'll give you some background on that. But they began to call it archiving. And in physics, in high-energy particle physics, where we have this famous archive called archive.org, about 90% of the particle physics articles published today are on that archive, freely available. And 100,000 physicists go in every day, every week, let's be fair with this, every week to look at those articles. And none of them go to the journals. Because if it's published in the journal, it's already 6 months, 8 months, or 12 months old. And so they are looking at the archived version. Now, what did the journals do? Did the journal say, we won't publish you if you put your work freely available on the archive? No. The journals, if they had said that, would be very thin journals. Because all of that work was already going up, and it was so integral to the quality and the communication in that community that they said, okay, we'll be big about it, you can do it. And they gave permission. And now, today, all of the major publishers, meaning Elsevier, and there's not very many major publishers, unfortunately. The corporate concentration is quite extreme in scholarly publishing. It looks like broadcast media. It is Elsevier at the top, and maybe Springer, Wiley, Blackwell, Taylor and Francis. I feel like I'm missing one. Sage. And that's pretty well it, but all of them have a policy in very small print. You can't even expand it on your computer because it says right on it, very small print, that says you have a right as an author because you worked so hard on this work, because you obtained the money for the research, because this is your life and your intellectual property. You have the right, if you publish it with us, after you have transferred all other rights to us, you have the right to put your final draft, after it's been accepted from peer review, your final draft up on your website or in an institutional repository run by your library. Do we have one here?
Yes, we do.
Oh, we do. What's it called?
ScholarWorks.
ScholarWorks? San Jose's is called ScholarWorks.
It's a CSUI.
Oh, okay. Right. And because of Springer, we're calling it ScholarWorks to show how cosmopolitan we are. So we have an archive here. So you have permission. We have permission as scholars to take articles that we publish in very expensive journals. You know the story about this. California's done wonderful things about how expensive the journals are. You've seen all these sort of things about 2 Volkswagens equals brain research for 1 year, you know, that kind of, okay. So you know how expensive it is. So even if you publish in brain research, you have permission to put up your final draft in an institutional repository where it can be discovered and used by people who cannot afford brain research otherwise. And so potentially, and these are retroactive, like this could be all of Elsevier's work. Potentially, you can publish in an open access journal, maybe 6,000 or 8,000 of them, or you can publish in any of the other journals and still make your work open access. Now this is where it falls on our shoulders, those of us who are faculty members in the audience, because we haven't. We haven't taken advantage of this. So much so that the U.S. government has stepped in. And this is the third subset of that. But are we clear on the archiving? We can ask questions at the end of this, of course. But we have this permission in very fine print, the final draft, after peer review. We can update it and include a link to the published versions if the reader has access through their library, perhaps. So the U.S. government, just a year, in fact, this is an anniversary. This is the anniversary. A year ago, the National Institute of Health, which is the largest funding body, period. It's about $28 billion a year in terms of funding for research. National Institutes of Health do work in my area in reading among children and whole area of life sciences. They had a policy, a voluntary policy. Would you please deposit a copy of your work, since the United States taxpayers have funded your research. This letter from the presidents and provosts of the universities refers to 50% of the research that's conducted in the United States is funded by the U.S. government. Not all NIH, mind you, and they wanted to extend all NIH, but NIH is the leading body. I don't know if you know, but the funding for philosophy and the humanities isn't at the same level as funding for the biomedical side. I don't know if you realize that. Biomedical sciences. This actually becomes an issue, as I'll explain in a moment. So NIH has a policy passed 2 years ago, a voluntary one, which said, would you please deposit a final draft, not the published version, that belongs to the publisher, but the final draft that you had accepted after peer review. 4% of the faculty members complied and deposited it in PubMed Central, where you can get whole articles, whole text, full text. And so this is an issue. There's a lack of an awareness, a lack of sensitivity, a lack of sense of people's rights to this knowledge. And this is why the role of this library in sponsoring a talk like this is so important in terms of making this known and creating a sense of responsibility. So last April, the NIH escalated it and had it passed as a law as part of one of the big omnibus bills, that it would be required that if you took money from U.S. taxpayers to fund your research, you had an obligation to share that knowledge so that it would be available to your physicians, for example. And we're expecting the NIH, the National Library of Medicine actually is the key player here in terms of PubMed Central. National Library of Medicine estimates that there will be 80,000 articles when we reach full compliance, and we haven't. It's 1 year into the program. But we're about 60% in terms of compliance at this point. Compliance meaning articles that were published with NIH funding that were then deposited in PubMed Central. So we're going to see an astronomical increase, not in astronomy, but in biomedical research in terms of access to knowledge. And more importantly, we're going to see a rise in public expectations of having a right to that knowledge. That's sitting in a physician's office, and this as an educator warms my, as a Democrat, warms my democratically supporting citizen. I have to be careful, I'm from Canada. I can't just say I'm a Democrat. I'm not even a citizen at this point. We're going to have that experience of sitting in a doctor's office and a doctor saying, well, you know, there is something new. And maybe we should have a look at it. And there are many cases of patients coming into doctors' offices, maybe some of you. In fact, I know 80% of you have looked at health information online, if I can trust the Pew Foundation. And you're going to say, well, let's have a look at this research. And you're going to be able to access it. And you're going to participate, physician, patient, in a discussion about the latest research. And the doctor certainly will help you interpret it. But there's a much more, there's a much greater sensibility, a greater democratic sensibility when you have access to the knowledge, when you are participating. There's a greater educational opportunity as the physician explains to you, no, this study doesn't quite apply in this case. And so the possibility then that this access to knowledge is going to change the democratic quality of our daily lives, well, maybe not daily, hopefully not daily, but certainly on a periodic basis, is an important aspect in terms of open access. And this mandate, which has been resisted, which the publishers have been very concerned about, and I am prepared to talk about, and I will talk about the publisher's position on this, has become law in the National Institutes of Health and is now before Congress in a bill called the Federal Research Public Access Act to apply to all of research. Because if you have a right to the latest research on medicine, then what about education? What about the legal system? What about the environment? Why don't we have, what about mortgages and derivatives, for heaven's sake? Why don't we have a right to all of the work that we have as citizens, and I am an income tax paying, if not a citizen, member of this community. And so that principle has come. And the idea that the university presidents, now this is a big step for someone who's worked in this movement for 10 years. And that is, we've always had the libraries, and I've always been very appreciative of the libraries in terms of this involvement. But to have the provosts and presidents of the universities involved suggests we might now become part of what it means to be a public institution, or to be, as it were, in a private private institution, a tax-exempt institution, in terms of what it is we give back to the community. Now, what is the publisher's position on this? How is this being funded? How can we have this knowledge for free? Like, isn't that somehow wishful Canadian health plan thinking? No. Sort of. Maybe. Jack London should be with me here now, because there is an aspect of this. And let me explain how this is working. The Public Library of Science. Remember the Public Library of Science in San Francisco has 7 or 8 journals. It's got top-ranked biology, almost top-ranked medicine. It has a journal of neglected diseases. Like I get a little quiver when a journal of diseases that you other journals have neglected. That was the original title. They decided it was too long. Diseases that we haven't been paying enough attention to, and people are dying monthly. Didn't work either. The Gates Foundation, which has not been involved in journals, but has certainly been involved in biomedical research, has supported PLOS, Public Library of Science, to publish a journal of neglected diseases. And I think it's just a fabulous thing. Top in its field. Okay? Not very many journals working in this field, but it's essentially, you know what it is. It's tropical diseases, right? It's malaria. It's river blindness. It's a whole series, and yeah, I mean, part of my experience has been talking to medical researchers who felt in Africa, who felt they couldn't get their work published in the North. And so it's a wonderful step in terms of that regard. But how do these journals work? And this is a kind of an eye-opener in many ways. I don't know if you realize that journals in different subject areas work on different economies. Remember, I made that little joke about philosophy versus the biomedical lab versus the philosophy professor sitting in his office, or her office, and the funding levels? Yeah, this is where it comes up, because PLOS in the biomedical field charges $3,000, well, actually a number of different fees, but roughly $3,000 an article to the author. They have to pay an article processing fee so that the article can be made freely available. This is not going to go in philosophy. $3,000 is a reasonable 5-year grant for their entire, pencils, legal-size paper, 2 erasers. That's the philosopher's typical budgetary requirements. Coffee. And so we have these very different economies. Just as the physics journals average about $3,600 a year, even though in high-energy particle physics, 90% of the articles are freely available, the price has not gone down. In my field in education, the journals are maybe $300 a year, not $3,000 a year. Is that because the particle physicists are rocket scientists? Well, actually they are. But it doesn't mean that we aren't in education, and that we're working with something very important, and the knowledge that we are attempting to establish is critical for the next generation of rocket scientists, as it turns out. So this idea then that the journals are working on very different economies is complicating the picture. And right now, in the biomedical field, there's a group called Biomed Central that has 200 journals charging about $3,000 about $2,500 article processing charges, and having no trouble publishing because it's coming out of the NIH grants. And NIH will allow for that kind of publication charge. And so we have this potential. And in fact, all of the major publishers, including Oxford University Press, but Springer and Taylor and Francis and Wiley Blackwell, all have a option, an open access option, for about $3,000. And it's getting taken up, Oxford says about 10% in some of the biomedical research, and Oxford is very good about it. Once it reaches 10%, they reduce their subscription price, because 3 or 10%, one article in 10 is already paid for and is freely available, so the subscriber shouldn't have to pay for that one. And so their prices, presumably, are coming down 10%, but it's not quite that way because there are all kinds of service charges and sorts of things. So this idea then that how are we going to be able to afford this? Well, one idea is that the article processing fees, that is that the researcher will have to pay for the articles. Now there is a logic to this. I mean, there's an irrefutable sense that it will not work because of the $3,000 figure. Because we don't have that kind of money in other fields, and because it comes from the isolation and inequity in funding. But the idea that we could work together to achieve a kind of balance of this figure seems to me one possibility. So one of the things we are talking about in Canada right now, in terms of this, and in terms of the joke I made earlier about the health plan, is the Canadian Social Science and Humanities journals. What could we do with the Canadian Social Science and Humanities journals? Let me use this as an example of how we have to get creative and think about this differently. So the Social Sciences and Humanities journals of Canada, averaging probably $150 annual subscription, will not work on a $3,000 article processing fee. What we're talking about is forming a cooperative with the libraries in Canada. The Canadian journals are subscribed to by libraries all over the world, but certainly they're subscribed to by Canadian libraries. So what if we said to the libraries, why are we selling our journal to you as a library? Why are we going through this bidding and having aggregators and third parties negotiating and all this sort of thing when you're just buying back knowledge that was produced in your institution in the first place? Why don't we form a cooperative between the scholarly societies, the libraries, and in Canada's case, the Canadian government provides subsidies as well to support Canadian scholarship. Why can't we form some sort of cooperative basis in which we take out the third party, the aggregators and others, and begin to support the journals themselves, and say that all of the money that is currently for subscriptions could support the journals, while at the same time make the journals freely available to everyone? What would that do? Well, what we know, and this is probably my final point, what we know in terms of what happens when you make something open access, what would it mean for Sonoma State if all of the faculty decided to make their work open access? It will increase the level at which your work is read, and it would increase the level at which it's cited. The studies are, again, not conclusive at this point, but a great number of studies, a good number of studies, what's the difference between great and good, I'm not so sure, but a good number of studies, dozens of studies, have documented how work that is made freely available increases the number of citations. Let me give you one example. The Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that put their article up on the web from PNAS, compared to those who did not. Those authors who did had three times as many, 3 times more citations. And so this improved their standing. Now, there are questions about, the selection. They were self-selected to put their articles up. Maybe they only put their best article up, so we can qualify it a bit. And certainly, as a social scientist, I have to say that I cannot guarantee these results. You cannot try this at home and expect the same results. But I can also say that there are a great number of studies that show an increase. And that in the sciences, much more so than philosophy and education, I must say, there is an uptake or a much greater uptake and an uplift in the number of citations. And so this idea that to share your work publicly, even though many of these journals are available in most libraries, PNAS would be, certainly, you can greatly increase the citations, perhaps by a factor of 3. So this is the limited term offer, the limited time offer. Because right now, 25% of the articles are freely available. And if you put your articles up, if in fact Sonoma State had a policy we do in the School of Education at Stanford is one of the things that I tripped onto when I got there and described my work and said that Harvard has a policy in 3 of its schools, maybe 4 of its schools now. Harvard has a policy where they are committed to putting everything they publish up in their archive, that they have come together and voted as a faculty to do that. I mean, they could always do it as individuals, but they're doing it as a faculty. And they prepared an author addendum to send to publishers that says, we're doing this. The final draft, not the published version, but peer-reviewed. If Sonoma State did that, then Sonoma State, presumably, from the PNAS example, that we don't want to extrapolate strictly, could increase not maybe 3 times, maybe 2.97, maybe 3.01. It could increase the number of citations that this institution obtained. Could also take a stand as a public institution to say that we think this is an important development, and even though individually we have this right from Springer and Elsevier and all of the journals, even though we have this right, we are coming together to take a stand and to say that we agree with this policy and that we are going to make it our policy to fill scholarworks, Springer, to fill the archive here so that the members of this community and the members of the world can have access to this knowledge. And Kansas has recently passed such a policy. MIT has. I haven't gotten it any farther than the School of Education at Stanford, I have to be honest with you, in terms of the spread of it. But there are these options. So let me go back over just a couple of these points. So there is the possibility of this cooperative between scholarly societies and libraries. It's maybe a pipe dream. There is the possibility, in fact, let me introduce one other aspect in terms of what can be done here. Well, I also have to mention one more thing, enjoying your library. This is such a brilliant marketing idea. Covering your books so they look like DVD cases is such a clever way of fooling students into taking out more books. I think this is like the most brilliant marketing idea I've ever seen. I looked at it and I thought, my God, it's a DVD. You have Library of Congress DVDs, and even the white and everything. And I opened it up. So I don't know. I've never seen this kind of covering system. Is it a way of preserving the dust jacket? Is that what it? And it's crayon proof. I tried putting a crayon on. Like I always carry a crayon with me. So the kids can't, you can just wipe off the crayons. Very clever. You have a program here in Sonoma Preservation, an undergraduate is that still going? What are they doing with their results?
This project is an archival project at this point. And the actual...
Oh, so they could not publish in an open access journal and gain some experience in the publishing process and peer reviewing while contributing back to their community some of the knowledge that they are acquiring as part of their historic North Bay Historic Preservation digital collection?
Well, now they are. We are doing it.
Oh, so you are, oh, good.
We are archiving it now. It's retrospective from a project that was in the late 70s.
That the students did in the late 70s?
Yes.
Oh, so the students aren't doing it now?
This permit is not in place.
Okay. Because there is an emphasis today on undergraduate research, and I don't know if you have, Sonoma has some of the programs underway in undergraduate research. That would be a good example, doing local history and preservation. And this idea then that as part of the policy to make the digital archives available is certainly one aspect of that, but the idea of beginning to build a journal culture among the undergraduate students, to give them an opportunity to begin to experience both the peer review element, but also the joy and pleasure of sharing what they're learning in a clearly identified student journal. Because the change that is going to happen, the increase, the historic moment that we're at, is going to happen not out of the indifference of faculty members. I'm quite convinced that's not going to change too quickly. But it is going to happen out of the expectations of the public. It is going to happen because university presidents say, people are concerned. This is an easy win-win for us at no additional cost. We can begin to change the position, the public position of this institution. It's going to happen because the public is going to say, how come I can't find out what I paid for? How come my teachers, my children's teachers, my physician, my lawyer can't discover what has been learned at public expense. And out of those public expectations, the position of the university is going to change. And just as the monasteries, the most closed of closed institutions, opened its doors to share the few beautifully illuminated, heaven knows if they ever came back, books that they had, I'm hoping that in the next 5 years that the universities in the United States will begin to take that as a given, as a responsibility that they will embrace. Thank you very much. Now, I would be very happy. Ooh, I went too long. I'd be happy for questions or yes.
I love this because the attacks in education on reading started in the mid-90s, and they were funded by the National Institute of Child Health.
Right, that was NIH, yeah.
They had a hegemonical control of information, and because it had the imprimatur of the federal government on it, people thought these lousy studies were knowledge. And I have a trouble with access to knowledge because it sort of seems like it's a thing out there, but maybe that's semantics. But people have been clubbing people over the head in education with these really bad studies, and now Reed Lyon, who helped us develop No Child Left Behind and all the horrors that have come since then, fit into this access thing, but it was a very controlled access.
Yes, yeah.
But it still had higher status. And just because it's the federal government funding it doesn't mean it's good. And in fact, it means just the opposite because they had an agenda. And this idea that these are all folks who are committed to their profession and not to making a buck is one of those things we need to interrogate and just assume that, you know, we're all in this for the good of our profession versus other kinds of nefarious kinds of things.
But the openness would support the...
And that's what I'm thinking.
Oh, right.
Is that dialogue has been suppressed, and that's what it's gotten.
Yeah, so there is a sense in which not all of the knowledge is necessarily good, and education has been more agenda-driven than NIH even. And so my hope is that just the sheer openness of it will raise the level of debate and allow for a diversity. In education, the emphasis on quantitative measures and testing, for example, versus other kinds of research has been controversial, but it has also been a matter of selective access, supported by the Department of Education. So there are nuances to the politics of all this, and there are issues in terms of that, but I'm asking you to consider the principles at this point, the larger principle, in the hope that the greater access will allow those things to emerge, along with some investigative reporting by newspapers and other areas in terms of the funding and financial conflicts of interest. Other comments or questions? Yes?
Yeah, I wonder whether you can comment on the kind of broader social and economic context in which you see this happening. Because when you were talking about, you listed various open movements.
Yes.
Right? Open data, open notebook, open research instrument. And it struck me that there are also outside, like information, there's now seed banks. So people have seed banks and they take in seeds and they give away seeds, and that's kind of an open movement in itself. We have microloans, which is kind of an open movement. It's a small thing that doesn't mean anything to me that I can give to somebody else, where it's very important. So that's another thing.
It's open credit in a sense.
It's a kind of form of open credit. So do you have anything to say about what you see happening here? And maybe also take in like the Library of Alexandria way back.
Yes.
Was that an open library, or was the society in which that happened, was that a very different kind of society? So how do you play this out?
There's a point where it can't be everything, because then it loses its emphasis, loses its focus. I was asked to repeat the question, but it's... If there was a broad, I was asking about the larger sense of openness and whether the library in Alexandria, which has been reborn in print and digital forms, would be an example of that. In other areas where there's a greater openness. I think the social movements, I mean, one of the parallels would be the mobilization in terms of social movements today. The ability of using the web to create very large social movements among seemingly disparate groups. Is a greater sense of openness in terms of organizational ability. I think, from my perspective, at least in terms of the university's responsibilities, I'm taking it fairly narrow. The parallel with the public library movement would be a natural. Let me just do that for a second. In the 19th century, the public library movement was a huge focus and took many years in order to achieve its goals. And it had a very similar kind of sense of you need to trust us, and that people have a right to this knowledge, and that it will improve the quality of the society. And there were great debates in at the turn of the century about including newspapers, for example, in the public library, because you would just get riffraff. I mean, if they're not getting a daily newspaper at breakfast brought in by the help, then why would we want them in the library? And there were even odoriferous, I think was the word, odoriferous maybe, was the complaint, and there were suggestions in public libraries to keep the newspapers at the front, to keep that crowd. So there are all kinds of particular parallels, and what I'm trying to do, and maybe I didn't do this tightly enough, is suggest that within this particular framework that we work in, of universities funded in the production and sharing and conveyance of knowledge, that there is a convergence of specific elements. The platform, software, the data and research in terms of open data and open notebooks, and then the sharing of that information in terms of open access. There's one more I didn't include, and that's open educational resources. So OER, I didn't want to confuse you, but very relevant for our field of education, if I can include you in this. Open educational resources is a movement to make all of the work that we, not all of the work perhaps, but all of the things that we create for educational purposes, the instructional modules. We were talking about the Kosala family and that funds my chair, and they have a group called, Niru Kosala runs a group called CK12 that is making open textbooks as an example of open educational resources. So the idea that teachers can share these resources, these learning resources, faculty members can share them, and there's even a peer review, a group called Merlot, that peer reviews open educational resources. Our hope was that Google would build an engine to find open educational resources. That hasn't happened yet, but it's a prospect. So there is I mean, it can be extended across the entire society, but I'm trying to, at least in this talk, to focus it on this particular quality of knowledge and certainly its educational implications. Question more? I understand the cheese is here now, but yes?
I have a comment and a question. I wanted to add one more comment about the digital project. Those undergraduates who are under a federal grant. So what's happening today would be probably obliged to do what we're already doing. But my question was, do you see a tipping point?
Yeah, very good.
Make a little prediction here about a tipping point for especially academic.
No, Malcolm Gladwell, Canadian, by the way. Is there a tipping point? I think there is, and I just don't want to be wrong about it. The 80,000 articles that the federal government is mandating be made open access, to me, has a tipping quality to it. The presidents of the leading universities getting behind this notion and paying attention to it in terms of a federal mandate across all of the research areas has that sensibility to it. I would say there's no turning back. I'm not sure where the tipping point suggests this thing going to accelerate greatly, and I would suggest at least that it is going to happen. That we have 25%. When will it be 50% of the literature that's available? I think that the libraries are going to play the key role in terms of tipping. If everybody, all of the library staff could get to one end of the building, if the libraries can not let it ride, but continue to make it an issue and a point of and the best example is in ScholarWorks, or ScholarWorks. In ScholarWorks, if the article of the day came up on the university's website, if there was just a sense of playing on the vanity of faculty, and I hate to say that, I know it's, and perhaps here it doesn't exist. Perhaps it would. It would not. I know in my institution it would, so if there are ways in which this can just be made present, because it is happening for the public, in terms of, for example, the health information, the number of the percentage of the public that are going into looking at health information. And if it could become part of the university's position in terms of how it situates itself with regard to projects like this, but also with regard to the knowledge that it produces. And then finally, if it could involve the students at some level. The thing I would just say about students, if I could add one more thing, and that is, are we educating our students to take advantage of this open access? Are they learning that when they leave this institution, they will have access to 25% of the literature today? And 2 years out, maybe 30 or 40%. So we could have a ceremony at Sonoma State where, oh, I put my wallet away. Has anyone got a library card? Has anyone, no one carrying a library card? We could have a ceremony where we could explain to them, thank you, we could, younger, we could explain to them that normally when you leave this institution, we would cut your library card and you would have no more access. But at this point, we don't have to do that because you have access to knowledge in a way that you didn't realize. And we spoil students by giving them course packs, by giving them links to articles, and so they don't discover what portion of the literature is freely available. And so we need to think about in our undergraduate education, how can we include in our subject areas a way in which they learn what they will have access to? I mean, because it seems to me ironic that we would build up such enthusiasm for knowledge and then cut their library card at the very point where it reaches its, well, actually 6 months before, it reaches its pinnacle. And so, in fact, we're doing a study on course packs to show not only that they are not very productive and very expensive, but that they are defeating the educational goals we have, which is lifelong learning. Because if we are, in a symbolic way, cutting the library card by not teaching them access to this knowledge once they leave this institution, then we are not fostering lifelong learning. But mind you, we're hooking them to come back for another degree. But who's to argue with that? Thank you. Oh, do you think you get a question now because you lent me the library card?
Yeah, I thought
I'm sorry.
I like your rabble-rouser approach to stuff. You know, in addition to having faculty talk about the idea of publishing in or archiving work in open access areas, I'm wondering if you know of a way to instigate a discussion for faculty to talk about having the scholarly societies that they belong to bring back their journals from publishers to the scholarly society and to publish their own journals. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yes. Do you have $10 in your wallet? No. Because that's what's going to stop that from happening. But what can happen, that is, they are in contractual arrangements with the publishers, and they are getting, my society, American Educational Research Association, turned its journals over to SAGE, and the price of the journals doubled. SAGE said, we can guarantee you more money than you're getting right now. Our society said, wow, we'll do that. We didn't realize what they would do was just double the price of the journal and give us 10% of that. So I don't think we can challenge that, but what we can say to our societies is that we need to foster both. That we are addicted to the revenue, fine. But does that mean we can't start alternative journals? Does that mean we can't start a graduate student journal? Does that mean we can't demonstrate some aspect of our work that will be freely shared? And so I would encourage those of you involved in scholarly societies to look for opportunities. In economics, any economists here? Econometrics, don't be ashamed. I know it's dismal. So the Econometrica is a well-established journal, and that society is publishing, I can't be 4, but I think it is 4 journals coming up over the next couple of years, new journals that will be open access. But they will still sell their flagship, as it were, subscribed. So it's a hybrid model. It doesn't have to be an either or. We have to learn how to compromise. Even if your society has an archiving policy, it costs nothing to have an archiving policy. Many societies, in fact, all the major corporate publishers have archiving policies. It's the societies that have been dragging their feet. So they can sell subscriptions, but they have a very clear and encouraging, because it will help the journal. More citations will increase the ranking of the journal in the society. So we need to give them a number of tiered steps, archiving? Do we have an explicit policy in our journal that encourages archiving? Secondly, are we helping graduate students with an open access journal? Are we providing, allowing for academic freedom? You've been very patient with me, but academic freedom is an issue here. You cannot start a journal today. I don't know how to tell you this, but you cannot start a subscription journal today. How would you sell a copy to a library? Do you have any extra money for a new journal? No. And if you cannot start a journal, you do not have academic freedom. Feminists in the audience, women's studies without signs, without Journal of Women's Studies would not exist if it didn't start journals in the 70s and 80s. And today, I challenge you to begin to undertake that unless it's open access. So very briefly, there's a journal called Open Medicine that the editors of the Canadian Journal of, the Journal of the Canadian Medical Association were fired. The editors of the Journal of the editors of the Canadian Journal, the Canadian Medical Association Journal, CMAJ. The Canadian Medical Association Journal editors were fired in a case of professional association interference. They felt it was an academic freedom issue, and it clearly was, and they started an open access journal that is now certainly not ranked #1 by any means, but that gets into the newspaper regularly in Canada, and is a good example of how open access can support academic freedom. So your society, this university, by saying to its faculty, we will support open access publishing by installing my software, for example, but anyone else's as well, is a way of increasing and this would be a good thing to do in Academic Freedom Week. Do we have an Academic Freedom Week? No, we have a Freedom to Read Week, though. A good thing to do in a Freedom to Read, perfect tie-in. Freedom to Read week. I'm sorry, I'm losing my language here. Too much work. So to look for those kinds of opportunities, I like the Freedom to Read week. So we'll start a journal here, undergraduate research journal, open access, free to read on Freedom to Read week. Tears welling, I know, wonderful. So thank you very much, people.